We started doing this in Google, so the noises are all different. It's less overt, whereas Gladys from Zoom like screams at everybody when they start the recording. But we are recording now, so we can start this week's episode of Kinda, which is a podcast based on demystifying narratives about Ukraine that the West doesn't understand very well. I'm Ben Stewart, and the voice that you're listening to, yay Artem.
Yeah, I'm Artem, like that you can hear right now, the voice you can hear right now. Yeah.
And I'm a new voice to this podcast.
We have a guest. You're our first official guest. You'll get the care box package hopefully by October. We'll do our best. All questions to our fiscal department. That is also currently in development, but we're very happy to have you on today. So thank you for coming in. Very happy to hear your take on all of these things, because this week's episode is one that I'm uniquely not equipped to talk about, which is why facilitating this conversation was, much more important than me actually running my mouth. So we're going to talk about why some Ukrainians still speak Russian, still being kind of a trigger controversial word. I think the better format for the topic might be how the Russian language got to Ukraine and why in some cases it still persists. In any case, it's a very popular engine for Russian propaganda. They love to do the whole empire thing. They love to promote the narrative that if for any of those people that watched Tucker Carlson's interview with Putin, that, the Rurik dynasty then just teleported, well, whatever, after the 40th minute of him ranting at Tucker Carlson, that, the Rurik dynasty basically just teleported from Kyiv into then magically became Russia, which was also Moscow, and ignores a lot of obvious truths that Americans and probably Europeans as well are not acquainted with, because there's no specific reason why they would be. So we're going to hash all this out, and we have to start with very simple questions, and we're going to get a little deep and try not to rabbit hole too hard. Sound good to everybody? Alrighty. So as with any good episode, we have to start with the Vatnik of the week. So Vatnik of the week is going to be Pope, I keep wanting to say John Paul, Pope Francis, right, who has 5 other names because he's a Latin. I think there's probably some Italian in there. But he unfortunately is the leader of the Roman Catholic Church and the head of the church dogma, and he has the biggest hat of all the Catholics, the true Catholics. I don't mean the Greek Catholics. I'm going to be lynched in Lviv when I go back if anyone listens to this. But the reason he's the Vatnik of the week is for several reasons. Off the top of your head, who knows why Pope Francis is Vatnik? Who can speak to the Pope's Vatnikness?
It's difficult to say that the church is so big at the moment. But usually, his message is that we need to talk to Russians. I mean, we as Ukrainians.
Not only he talks to Russians, but he's actually promoting this, brotherhood between Ukrainians and Russians, and say that we all should sit together and forgive each other.
To exactly, hit the nail on the head reasons. There's actually so many reasons that I had to make a table in a Google document in order to get through all the garbage that he's unfortunately been spewing since the start of the war. So this specific picture is with, what's his name? The Tobacco Metropolitan himself, Patriarch Kirill of the Moscow Patriarchy. No, the Patriarchy. Well, anyway, the Moscow Orthodox Church, who, as far as I'm aware, and again, please feel free to inject context if it's lacking here, he has a net worth of several $1 billion because he and the Moscow Orthodox Church got very rich in the 90s by circumventing a lot of tariff laws in Russia. So basically what they were able to do was to take tariffs and taxes off of certain imports and then sell them for a huge amount of money, which is why they call him the Tobacco Metropolitan, because he's accrued, several fortunes worth of fortunes by selling cigarettes. Is this the guy that they call the Mercedes Patriarch or whatever it is?
Yes, but that was also about the meme with the cross over his head.
Okay.
That was folded when he was 16.
Yeah. So we'll get into this a little bit later, and I'm not going to steal anybody's thunder, but this guy, the Moscow Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church, is in many ways outright just a network for Russian agents and soft power influence to go and spread discord and Russian propaganda abroad. So this is not some kind of, Americans might think of like a Mormon mission or some kind of Christians that no matter what you think about them, they're generally good people trying to generally do what they feel is a generally good thing, right? Trying to bring and spread goodwill in the version of the gospel and things like this. Lots of good videos and content out there about how the Russian Orthodox Church is very much just a spy network and a lever of influence for the Kremlin. So this is the Pope visiting the Moscow, this guy, Kirill, for the first time ever. This is the first time a Pope had ever visited the patriarch of the Russian Church, unfortunately. And what that does is that this is in 2016. So for context, Russia had already used Wagner and other separatist-backed, Russia state-backed military powers to annex territory in eastern Ukraine. They had annexed Crimea, and the Russians were also supporting Assad in Syria as he was chemical weaponing his own people. So the Pope decides that this is prime time to go make a visit and show how well the relations are being maintained between these two churches. Obviously, huge propaganda win for the Kremlin. Legitimizes them in a way that they should not be legitimized. If we move to the May 22 and February 22, once Russia started its full invasion, the Pope did one of his two actual reasonable deeds by going to the Russian embassy in the Vatican City or in Italy, one of the two, and expressing concern. Artem hit me.
I have to interrupt because I have to ask, just like what we're witnessing the photo at the moment. Who is on the right?
I believe that's Kirill.
Nope, it's Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople.
I pulled up. Did I use the wrong photo? After the Pope then calls Zelensky and says, hey, we'll do what we can. He reaches out to the head of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and says, I will do, quote unquote, everything he can to help the Ukrainian Orthodox Church get through this ordeal, ordeal being under generalization of the century. He then starts switching gears immediately afterwards in May of 2022. He starts bringing up narratives like, well, Ukraine problem, but Russia was provoked, at which point the Western world kind of says, wait, what? What do you mean they were provoked? Quote unquote, NATO was barking at the gates of Russia, starts tossing out narratives like this, which are patently false. Ukraine is not a NATO nation. Obviously, I do not think Ukraine is going to be a NATO nation anytime soon, no matter what the outcome of the war is. Even if they won the war tomorrow, I don't think their NATO accession is going to be particularly on the docket. But the Pope is now spreading the point narratives that are the top of the toolkit for the Russian Federation's propaganda campaigns. Russia wants to say it was attacked by NATO, it was threatened by NATO, therefore it invaded Ukraine, which is a NATO proxy because the Ukrainians have no power. It's all Joe Biden pulling the strings of a corrupt Nazi government, and, right? So the Pope starts echoing these narratives. Problematic to say the least. The Pope then decides a year later, this is August 2023, to take a video call with a bunch of Catholics in Russia. And he starts going off about how these Russians should recall their history, recall their great heritage, recall the accomplishments of Peter the Great, recall the accomplishments of Catherine II. It's talking about how they're the descendants of the great Russia, the great empire, and all this kind of shit. This is so tone deaf against the backdrop of Russia invading every single one of its neighbors, or having tried to invade every single one of its neighbors within the last 100 years, that he actually then went and walked back those statements. But we can revert here. At a later interview, someone asked him straight up, it's like, why can't you criticize Russia? Like, why are you unable to say that this is Russia has unilaterally invaded Ukraine now twice? And he just gave this very wishy-washy answer about how we need to condemn war and we need to move away from war and we need to stop manufacturing weapons of war. And on top of that, he then blames the cruelty of the Russian brutality that has happened in places like Bucha and Luhansk and all these other places. He blames it on the Chechens and the Buryats and all the non-white Russians, quote unquote. Shit that I can't make up. Generally, or rather, open quote, generally, the cruelest are perhaps those who are of Russia but are not of the Russian tradition, whatever that means, such as the Chechens, the Buryati, and so on. Certainly the one who invades is the Russian state. That is very clear. Sometimes I try not to specify so as not to offend and rather condemn in general, although it is well known whom I am condemning. But he can't actually say it. He can't say I condemn the invasion of the Russian Federation into Ukraine. So, let's talk about the subtle racism here. Let's talk about there's a conversation that could be had about the fact that Putin does indeed, I think, try to defend the white sons of Moscow in order to save what shreds of popularity he has left in that place by throwing poor minorities that, make no money at the Ukrainian front lines and the Ukrainian trenches. But that's a whole separate conversation. This is still someone just said, "Hey Pope, why can't you say that Russia's a bad guy?" And he said, "Oh, it's those Asians, it's those like pseudo Mongols that are the bad people. The Russians are fine." It's like, what? Okay, God's gonna be fine with that one. So that's why he's Vatnik of the week. Unfortunately, I feel like he might go around for 2 a little bit later down the line because he just is having some trouble with saying like, look, Russia needs to stop. It's what Jesus would do. Oh, I forgot about his one spicy comment. Shortly after he started dropping all this Russian propaganda echoing of the NATO proxy war and shit like that, he then warns the Russian patriarch to not be Putin's altar boy, which is, again, it's like telling water not to be wet. So I'm not sure what he was trying to get at here, but this is reflective of someone that's either massively ignorant or they're just, for lack of a better word, a total bitch and refuses to say anything of substance on the international stage against the Russians. So anything about that to add?
Yeah,
Nope.
I have a question about the photo first. Like, do you know the KGB ranks of both of the people, Putin and Patriarch? Do you know their KGB ranks?
I don't know the patriarch's KGB rank. Oh, Ira, go for it.
It's a general. So the Patriarch has higher rank than Putin has.
Because I knew that was a good point. So I forgot that the Tobacco Metropolitan Patriarch Kirill himself is indeed a career KGBist. As old good men of Jesus are, directly involved in sabotage and Russian spy networks.
In this line, this actual news line makes a lot of sense. The figures that Pope Francis knows who Pasha Mercedes is, that he has higher ranks, and he's reminding him not to be Putin's altar boy and just act according to this rank. Maybe Pope knows something.
I'm assuming that the Pope would not be making the kind of digs that people made on Catholic altar boys when I was in high school. So I like your take on it better.
Thinking that the Pope has some sentiment for white people, and like considering the fact that Pope is from Argentina, where like enormous, like the most of Nazis flew after the Second World War. So the Pope has cool arguments about provocations, of which he probably know from the witnesses. All that, like they're like, I don't know, grandchildren. Talk about. So this is funny when the Pope from Argentina knows how to explain what was provocation towards Russians.
That is against the backdrop of Argentina being the, how do I put this? People that are so white that they reflect sunlight in Latin America, and they're basically an island in that kind of context because they're all generally huge influx of post-World War II and or during World War II emigration from Italy and Germany. So excellent point. Probably shouldn't ask anybody about what their grandfather did when they were young down in Argentina. You'll get some spooky answers.
You don't need to ask. You just can ask about their siblings, like brothers and sisters. If they have bigger families, you can pretty much guess what they did during the Second World War because they didn't die.
Good take. No, I'm just saying it's a good take, actually.
Yeah. It's just like the only place in Latin America will be like, and like, what's your grandpa's name? And they'll be like, Hans. Like, whoa.
By the way, it seems like Pope always speaks his mind, but because if you Google Pope Francis news today, you will get the top stories. In the top stories section, you will get the news with the lines like Pope Francis apologizes over reported homophobic slur. Pope apologizes after being quoted using vulgar term, or Pope apologizes for using something else. So basically he speaks his mind every time, but then his PR team has to retract that and make him look like, I don't know, genuine person, or else.
Unfortunately, only God can cancel him.
No, the next Pope also can.
Well, in any case, he's the Vatnik of the week. Him and his PR team and the altar boy dig. There's that altar boy dig might have layers now. I'm looking at that again. It probably has fewer layers than I assume it has, but it still has layers. In any case, if we're talking about why Russian language persists in Ukraine, we have to ask ourselves the age-old question: what is a language? And the answer is nobody really knows. So from a linguistic perspective, it's very hard to quantify what a language should be because there are so many inconsistencies that happen when you start getting on a more local level. And societies are not, homogenized white McFlurries of linguistic usage. So it gets really hard. And people think like, oh, well, why? You speak English. And it's like, okay, well, tell me, Google Scottish Twitter and tell me how much of that you understand. Listen to an Australian talk and tell me how much of that you understand. There's just thousands, if not tens of thousands of iterations of the English language. So which one is like the English language, right? Which one is the English language? No one really knows. There's a quote that I learned in college that was, I forget who said it. I don't want to say Noam Chomsky, but it might have been Noam Chomsky because he just gets quoted a lot in undergraduate linguistic circles. But he's saying that a language is a dialect with an army and a navy, which leans towards the idea that there is a critical mass of speakers that have to have something that is at least mostly mutually intelligible in order for that to be called a language. So if we start with that criterion, English now fits, right? You guys understand me, I understand you, I understand the Scottish understand you, and there's this whole mutual intelligibility thing that exists, right? Whereas like with Chinese, they have 6 or 7 primary dialects that are not mutually intelligible verbally, even though they share a writing system. So for the purposes of this, I guess we can talk about what this should be in terms of a definition of language, but I'm still going to stick kind of like to the mutual intelligibility argument in order to classify what this should look like, because that at least touches on the more linguistic points of things that are boring that no one wants to talk about, like semantic similarity, morphological similarity, semantic distance, historical roots, resistance to new words, resistance to loan words, adherence to, I guess, what you would call like whatever proto language they have. In this case would be Proto-Slavic. But the reason that I bring this up is because people don't have a good sense of this. And I love this picture because it's like people that read Cyrillic will know an attempt was made and the ball was dropped. Because again, people trying to put these things in boxes. We like putting things in boxes, but the box doesn't really make any sense, right? So sometimes there are several boxes within the box, and we're going to talk about what the Ukrainian language actually historically is more related to. Turns out it's complicated, but it's not as complicated as Russia really wants you to think, or Russia wants anybody to think. I don't think I can draw. Can I draw? How do I annotate?
Yes, you can.
Draw. Wow. All right. So if this is the Slavic bubble, right? You see this little loser over here in the corner? That's the Russian language. And the reason that this guy's hanging out over here by himself is because Russia is, in many ways, an outlier when it comes to what linguistic scholars and the people that actually study languages are going to generally group together as a core Slavic language, because the other languages are much more similar to each other. That's the whole point. Point being made. If we take another look at a map of the semantic distance between languages of Europe, we have the big Slavic languages over here in the corner, in the bottom right. You'll see that Ukraine is very, very close to Belarusian. It's pretty close to Polish. You're getting some, I guess some second degree separation to Bulgarian and things like that. But once again, Russia is kind of off here by itself in the corner. Whereas the Russian narrative is reliant on Russia being this only language that ever existed, and Ukrainian being this peasant dialect of it. Ira, you look frustrated. You should chime in.
Yes, it's not only they claim that, but they also claim that Ukrainian language was invented. And I would like to air quote invented, because it doesn't make any sense. A lot of people believe that it was invented, but if we get back to the definition of language and what language is, every single language was invented eventually by people who agreed to use similar sounds or something else. So some languages were invented earlier than others and just became the background or the basis for other languages. So if we say that some language was invented, then all of them were invented and thus can also be considered artificial and, I don't know, dismissed or whatever.
What languages are actually artificial? And by that artificial, I mean a group of people got together and said, hey, let's make up a language right now, and then just artificially adopt it, other than Esperanto.
Well, any programming language is still language, because language is the way of communication. So any programming language, it was invented, and it's used, and it's still used for communication, different types. So that
higher level hot take, I like that. But the overarching point being that Ukrainian, as a language that was not artificially invented, it was, a language that evolved somewhere, I understand, around the 14th, 15th century, when the old East Slavic languages really started to splinter. But again, I'm not the Ukrainian here, so I'm going to move through my slides kind of quicker and start letting you guys do the talking. But just as an illustration of the way that these things are different, right? If we're talking about this false pretense where Russia is the umbrella language and then Ukrainian is a dialect, you would expect to see similarities across these things. You would expect the Russians to understand the Ukrainians, at least, right? Because the Ukrainians are ostensibly speaking some made-up artificial dialect of the great Russian Empire language that Pushkin and Tolstoy and Dostoevsky did not speak in their homes, by the way. But we can talk about that later. So, very simple stuff, and I'm not going to read the slide to anybody. You would expect to see, even like with Spanish and Italian, you see a lot of similarity with Spanish and French, things that are within the same family and things that are known to Americans. You can get a lot of overlap, especially when reading, between these things. Same thing with languages, again, that are closer. English and Dutch, pretty damn close. English and German, you still see hints of German all through English. You see words like knife. You see, in Pennsylvania, you can order a Bauernsfrühstück, which is just a farmer breakfast. Very normal thing. Male choirs in Pennsylvania, Mainer Chor, male choir, man choir. Like, you can even hear it in the words themselves. But in this case, you can't, because Ukrainian and Russian are distinct languages. They are very much their own thing. They happen to exist in the same superstructure of Slavic languages. There is no verticality here. The Ukrainians have their own alphabet. They have their own grammar. They have an extra case that the Russians don't use anymore. The Ukrainians use less loan words. It says right here in Wikipedia, there is more mutual intelligibility with Belarusian and closer distance to like Polish and Bulgarian. So Ukrainian's not even playing on the same block as the Russian language. This will be a good one for people to pause. So I'll give everybody an opportunity to pause. I hope you use your opportunity to pause. If you want to compare what this actually looks like in even more table format, I guess is what we can call this. The Russian word for coffee is even different. I mean, Christ, come on. This is like, this is very, very basic stuff. And again, this is for people that speak Ukrainian, just saying that, Ukrainians have over 80% common lexicon with the Belarusians, and then you have Polish next in line, and you have the Slovak next in line, not Czech. And then somewhere down in fourth place, you have some general overlap of 60-ish% of the words, and this is just one scholar estimating this. 60% is also not as high a number as you think it is. We now have to get into what is the Ukrainian language and where did it come from. So this is going to be mostly maps. Back when you can see this big empty stretch of nothing in the map, people that are watching this on YouTube, I'm looking at a map of the Eastern Slavic tribes and peoples in the 8th to 9th centuries. And it's mostly where you see Ukraine, Belarus, kind of a bit of the Baltics, going into a little bit of Poland, and then that's about it, right? And they're doing their own thing. 985, Volodymyr the Great comes in. He decides to introduce Christianity to what he was ruling at the time. But there were two major principalities at that time. I understand the Principality of Kyiv and the Principality of Chernihiv. What was then Chernigov, now Chernihiv. Bringing back to the map, this is at this point 11th century, even into the 12th century. There's nothing in Russia going on. There's nothing in Moscow. There's no reference to either of these things. However, Kyivan Rus, which is a dangerous, often misappropriated name in English, because it actually refers to the Ruthenian people and the Ruthenian language groups, emerges around this time. Artem, at what point did the Varangians come in? Do you remember?
They were coming all the time. So they were like, we believe Oleg was the first one.
But the point being, even at the point of the 8th and 9th centuries, and especially when you're moving into Kyivan Rus, there was this language that is now referred to as Old Eastern Slavic, is the language being spoken here by Rus, which will later become several sub-principalities, but we'll get into that in a moment.
Yeah, so it's like 912.
912. So even earlier, right? Again, back in 912, there's no historical reference to Moscow existing because there was nothing there. There's no historical reference to anything Russian, Russian, existing. So this continues on for several hundred years. The Old East Slavic, the principalities of Kyiv and Rus are sometimes fighting, sometimes not, largely establishing trade along that whole axis from the north up to Scandinavia, down into Constantinople and things of that nature. We could do a whole series on this. I'm being very quick for the sake of time here. Things get very shitty around the 13th century with the emergence of a small startup called the Golden Horde that sweeps over most of Asia and eventually sacks Kyiv. So no one's having a good time. The sons of Genghis Khan, who killed so many people that he literally cooled the earth and raped so many people that his genetic markers can still be found in a significant portion of the population there, occurred. So nobody in then Kyivan Rus had a good time, or the successor state to Kyivan Rus, which is called the Kingdom of Ruthenia with a hard TH. So now we're up into the mid 1200s up to the mid 1300s. Okay. While this is also going on, the Crusades are happening again around the 1200s. So the Crusades are hitting different streets. The Crusades are crusading in the north, they're crusading in the south, they're crusading to take Jerusalem, Days Vault, Ave Maria, and all that good stuff. So no one's having a good time. One of the reasons that things were a bit chaotic as well is because, as far as I could tell from my cursory reading, when everybody had these little states set up, the state of Chernihiv, the state of Novgorod, the state of Chernigov, and things like that, there was no clear order of operations for succession, which led to a lot of infighting. It led to a lot of chaos. And that's ultimately, I think, what partially contributed to the collapse of Kyivan Rus, the emergence of the Kingdom of Ruthenia at this point in time. And those that are watching on YouTube and are particularly attentive might see we have a little thing here called Moscow, which is now on the scene in the late 13th century. So at the point that Moscow starts emerging on maps, Christianity has already been in Kyiv and Chernigov for
some time.
300 years. Yeah, 300 years. Yeah.
Yeah, but like Christianity came to Kyiv even before the church got split.
When was that?
Byzantine Church in Constantinople got split. What was that, like 1055 or 1054? So, and the Christianity came to Kyiv even before.
Well, that was Cyril the monk, was it not? He also brought partially the Greek alphabet up that has influenced the early Cyrillic writing systems, as far as I'm aware. Yeah. So all of these things are happening, right? This is a great, in terms of civilization, remarkable step forward. You have royal families in play. You have Game of Thrones drama in play. You have the massive transition of people into a Christian governance and Christian states when there was literally nothing in Moscow or most of what Russia is today. Lots of reasons, but at some point in time, right, let's just talk about this new Moscow thing that's come on the scene. So around 1300-ish, when you have the Kingdom of Ruthenia that then eventually moved into, if I am the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but we'll talk about that in a second. 1300 AD, Moscow is now a thing. Moscow is a thing. It controls territory that's not significant in any way. It's that little tiny green blob on the screen. Over the course of the next 100 years, it expands a bit. And then when we get up to 1505 AD, this Moscow as a concept, which is the Principality of Moscow or the Grand Duchy of Moscow, has expanded largely northward and northeasternward up into the ice wastes of, you know, Chelyabinsk and Arkhangelsk and all these other new like shitty areas where there's, I don't know, where not really a lot of Russian resources or natural resources, but probably less competition. The Golden Horde at this point is starting to collapse. And just so that we can see people that are watching on YouTube, that big green blob, there's a pretty clear line there between Muscovy, the Grand Duchy of Moscow, and the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth meaning like basically all the Baltics coming all the way down again into Belarus and Ukraine, and then expanding a little westward into Poland. And my last thing that I'll say before I kind of turn it over to y'all is that around, I understand, the 1500s, so maybe 15th, 16th century, is the time when this new term, Rus, R-U-S, Russia as a concept, is being noted on maps, and it is being used interchangeably with Muscovia, with Muscovy. The people that lived in this Grand Duchy of Moscow were referred to as Moskals, which is now an ethnic slur that is hilarious and used against Russians. One final note about the Polish, sorry, two final notes. The Ruthenian people in the Rusin language, not Russian, Rusin language, kind of went up a bit northwest into the Prussian area of, you know, what was back then. And then you have the emergence of the Prussian Empire and things like that. That was a horrible crash course in about 10 minutes of Ukrainian history to say that, look, very obviously Ukraine was here first. Very obviously they were very busy for several hundred years doing all sorts of great advancements and things of that nature, having politics, fighting wars, setting up trade routes, doing diplomacy, things of that nature, being sacked by the Mongols before the idea of Russia even comes onto the stage, right? So the number I'm going to say is about 600 years. We can lowball it at 500 from the establishment of Christianity in Ukraine and the emergence of this idea of what Russia / Muscovy could even be. And that lines up historically with the splitting of the languages themselves. So again, you have this Old East Slavic that's being spoken widely throughout Kyivan Rus, throughout Galicia, Volhynia. And then at the point when about the 15th century, when Muscovy enters the scene, they're entering under the scene with their own language because they're very far away from everything else that's going on. So they're separated away from people. They're losing the mutual intelligibility. They're losing the communication. Whereas the Ruthenian languages, the ones we've already talked about, the Ukrainian language, the Belarussian language, the Rusin language, are still very much in place, still very much doing their own thing, still very distinct, and obviously predate what is now Russian by several centuries. Popcorn R10 and era.
Yeah.
Is that
So like I saw the